Hey, awesome students. I'm so excited to have you with me in Introduction to Special Education. Over the next few weeks, you're going to feel like you're drinking from a fire hose as we're learning all this. But today, we're going to talk about some of our basic understandings of disabilities and what they mean. So the first question we need to ask, because it always comes back to a biblical perspective here, is how did Jesus treat individuals with disability? Well, one of my favorite Psalms is 139, and in verse 14, it hits the core of what is important here. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. Each of us was made in the image of God. That means we have automatic worth. This includes all our students in the classroom. Doesn't matter what their disability is. Jesus loves them, and we need to express that love for our students in our actions and the way we treat them and engage them in our classrooms. Now, the diverse populations of our schools is increasing. And as you can see on this chart right here, the students you teach in your classroom probably aren't going to look like you or have the same background or information or prior knowledge as you. And so we need to be aware that all of our students are going to be different. And it's not just in terms of disabilities. It could be race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And so we need to make sure that we are engaging all of those students. So where do these kids receive their education? Well, there's approximately 50 million children and youth who attend public schools in the United States right now. Charter schools are equivalent to public schools, but charter schools make about 6% of the total enrollment. However, this is different in different states because of charter school rules and the popularity of them. In LA, for example, 20% of students go to charter schools, and in DC, 50%. So it depends. It could be much larger than that. About 12% of students attend private schools, and approximately 4% are homeschooled. And all of these students in these different locations are diverse in respect to background, race, ethnicity, abilities, education provided through the education services in the system. And so our students are going to be very, very different. Now, when you look at this map, it looks at the population and the frequency of English language learners in different states. And the darker the green, the more prominent the English language learners in that state. And you can see Georgia here on the map is moderately green. So we have actually a large number of English language learners here in the state of Georgia. And it's important that we understand these students in the background and we take the time to examine our own biases and information that we store inside ourselves as far as these different backgrounds of our students. Now, students with disabilities in our classroom, they're going to qualify for services underneath one of 13 categories in what's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is IDEA, and it came about and changed in 2004. Now, students with disabilities, there's 13 different categories, and some of these when we look at, you may have never heard. Others you may have heard but don't know what it means. Don't worry, we're going to be covering all of them over the course of this semester. And about 14% of students receive services through special education. Now, with IDEA, all students in this program are guaranteed what's called a free and appropriate public education, FAPE. We're going to look in a little bit at how special education has changed over time. And one of the most dramatic changes is where the education of these students takes place. It is now inside the classroom alongside their peers. And so that's the idea of free and appropriate public education. However, there are some students who have disabilities, but they are not eligible to receive services through IDEA. And we're going to talk about how those students can be serviced through the Section 504 plan of the Americans with Disabilities Act shortly. Now, this is the IDEA categories in order of prevalence. Now, in special education, prevalence means how frequently something occurs. So your speech and language impairments are going to be the most frequent disabilities you'll see, followed by specific learning disabilities, other health impairments, autism or autism spectrum disorder as we go by now, intellectual disabilities, emotional disturbance, sometimes you might have heard it called EBD, orthopedic impairments, deaf and hard of hearing, visual impairments, multiple disabilities, deaf blindness combination, traumatic brain injury, and delayed development. Now, you might have noticed that gifted students aren't in IDEA. You are right. There are no federal laws mandating gifted services to students, nor are there monetary financial resources on a national level being granted to students who are gifted. And so gifted services are going to vary dramatically across the country. And this is a group of students that are often overlooked. The reason being, so often we as teachers are focusing on seeing improvement in those struggling learners, and we've got this group that already excels. And so we oftentimes just let them continue on the same track rather than pushing them and giving them differentiated instruction to help them grow even more. And so about 6 to 10% of students are considered giftedness due to high level intelligence. Sometimes it's creativity because you can be gifted in things like art or music or exceptional talents. Now, why, if these students are already successful, why would they need your attention? Well, number one, they're going to underperform in school because they're bored. They already go in knowing probably about 70 to 80% of the curriculum you're going to teach them. So you need to be pushing them, differentiating for them to stretch them to the next level. And these kids are going to be sort of put in the cracks because they are so smart and they are so capable. You're not spending all your time with them. They're not as needy as children that we're trying to bring up to grade level, and we see the potential in them and we really want to help them. And because these students are already so good, we oftentimes don't put as much energy into them. We also have the problem of what's called masking with twice exceptional students, and we're going to do a whole section on this much later. But these are students who are gifted and talented, but also have learning disabilities at the same time. Now, there's also this idea of social justice, the way we frame and see disabilities, and that can be simply seen by videos. I'm hoping you guys are familiar with The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Disney animated version you can see on the right. But when the movie was made in the 1930s, that was the image of Quasimodo that was portrayed. You have this person with a physical disability, and you can see he was made to be scary, unapproachable, ugly, frightening. You have this terror reaction. Versus Disney's Quasimodo, you can see he's lovable. He has these gentle eyes. He looks kind. He's not scary. He looks nice. And so you have this changing portrayal of people with disabilities. Now, how have they experienced unjust treatment across time? Up until about the 1980s, late 1970s, people with disabilities were simply, when they were born, most families locked them away because they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't know how to handle them. So they were placed in institutions, which were always not the best scenario. When we move into intellectual disabilities, I will share our own family's journey with this, because this perception of pushing them away was not what happened in every family. And I want to make you guys really, really understand that many this was the case, but not in all. Currently, there's very few institutions still left in the United States. In the 90s, they started changing from the idea of institutions to more of group home settings. And so there's very few in the United States, but across the world, there's still many others. So up until the 1970s, when students had disabilities, they were not granted access to the public education system. And this could be things simple as speech therapy, which frankly I had when I was a kid, or physical therapy. IDEA in 1974 guaranteed that free and appropriate public education, so these children could get their services in the public school system. So in the 70s and 80s, they were provided public education to meet their needs. But now they were going to be put in separate schools where they had specialized equipment, specially prepared teachers, related service. Right now, the recent focus is that they have the least restrictive environment, what we call LRE, that they're put in a classroom with their peers, and then they receive special education services either in that classroom or through a push-in from a special education teacher, or sometimes a pull-out to a resource classroom. Now, perceptions about disabilities matter, and there's three main perceptions that exist: the deficit, the cultural, and the sociological. The deficit perspective says that, okay, we rest on this bell curve, and I know you guys have heard that term before, and if 100 is average, that means that half of us fall below average as far as IQ, and half of us are going to be above average. The problem is, I don't want to be that lower half, to be honest with you. And so it's really easy to designate somebody as a disability when you're looking at it that way. And then you've got this cultural perspective on disabilities, and different cultures have different beliefs about disabilities. Families will have different ideas about what causes disabilities to begin with. What is the family's role in mitigating, or the school's role in that? And it also impacts, because of that, how they'll respond to you as an educator when you're talking about a child with disabilities. Now, you also have the sociological perspective, and this says this comes from society's need to stratify and classify individuals, and that it's society that handicaps individuals, that it's not a condition or a set of traits. Basically, they say disability doesn't exist, and this is dangerous because we are different. We do have disabilities. And if you've watched the video that I embedded on your course page as well, you've already seen this idea that words matter when you're talking about individuals with disability. We do have things such as Rosa's Law, which was put into effect, a federal law which replaced the term mental retardation with the term intellectual disabilities. And you can just hear in the intonation that it's a more positive language for that. The other point of the language is that we use what's called people first language. In other words, the individuals are not defined by their disability. We want to discuss the person first, disability second. Now, there are going to be exceptions to this, primarily the deaf community. They see their deafness as a definition of who they are, and so they want to be referred to that first. Oftentimes, we default to people first, and if there's ever a question, simply ask. People are willing to talk. Now, what we're trying to do is get more of these students to stay in school. Students with disabilities are twice as likely to drop out of school, and so we want them to remain in school. Students without disabilities systematically or substantially outperform students with disabilities. But here's the thing. 80% of students with disabilities can reach grade level. Oftentimes we're like, oh, they can't do it, they can't do it. 80% of them can, and so we need to focus on that. However, right now, there's not 80% reaching grade level. So what can we as teachers do to increase that? And those are going to be some things we discuss. Now, students with disabilities are also moving into post-secondary education. Right now, about 11% of undergraduates have disabilities. I know here on campus, we've seen the Office of Disabilities explode as far as the students they're serving. It's wonderful. Students are realizing and understanding that they have this right to receive services, and they're starting to advocate for themselves. 6% of doctoral degrees were earned by people with disabilities. And so it's just increasing those entering post-secondary education. Now in high school, there are transition plans set in place. And what happens is you move the student from the IEP to a 504. We'll get into more detail about this later. But in essence, the school is helping the students set up goals for what they want to do in college, where they want to go. If it's training skills or job site training or a 2-year college, and they work these transition programs to help them. So what progress has been made integrating people with disabilities into everyday lives? Currently, 61% of people with disabilities are competitively employed, which means they're making a living wage. Only 36%, though, are living independently, and we'd love to see that number go up. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, guarantees full access to daily life for people with disabilities. This means they have access to all public buildings. So when you see the ramps and the elevators and things of that nature, Braille on signs, that's making these accessible to these individuals. And then you also have changes that have happened in society that were meant for people with disabilities, but it benefits all of us. If you've ever pushed a baby stroller, you're thankful for those curb cuts so that you can get the stroller off. If you have a difficult time hearing when people are talking, closed captioning on TV is another one. That's a wonderful advantage, even for those of us without disabilities. And technology can also help those with disabilities. Technology that was meant for everybody can be specifically utilized to help those with disabilities. How many of us talk a message into our phone? That voice to text is something that people with disabilities, how many of us listen to an audiobook? That is, again, something with those with disabilities can utilize to help them engage in everyday life. I look forward to working through all of this with you.